Take it, she said. It's basically scrap. Maybe you can melt it down for something useful. Everyone laughed. Celeste Hargrove stood in the center of her late father's estate. 40 guests at her back, champagne flute in her hand, and pointed at the rust-eaten shape under the canvas tarp like she was giving away a broken umbrella. Her smile was the kind that had been practiced in mirrors. Her guests laughed the way people laugh when the host laughs. Reflexively, comfortably, without knowing or caring what they were laughing at. $9 million. That's what sat under that tarp. That's what she handed a single dad in a work jacket as a punchline to a joke she didn't know she was telling. $9,200,000 in dirty sheet metal and cracked vinyl and rust that ran up the lower panels like tide marks. And before the day was over, Celeste Hargrove would spend the rest of her life wishing she'd kept her mouth shut. But Nate Calloway wasn't thinking about $9 million in that moment. He wasn't thinking about any of it yet. He was thinking about the way his daughter Wren had looked at him that morning across the breakfast table. One hearing aid in, the other one in the little charging case on the counter because he'd forgotten to charge it overnight again. Eating her cereal with that particular careful, concentrated focus that she'd developed. The way she watched his mouth when he talked. The way she always positioned herself with her better ear toward the sound. The way she'd learned, before the age of 7, to do the work that other people never thought about. He was thinking about the surgery estimate folded in the glove compartment of his truck. $120,000, the audiologist had told him, speaking clearly and slowly the way people did around Wren. Even adults who should have known better. $120,000 after insurance. The insurance that covered 40%, which felt generous until you did the math on the other 60. He was thinking about the 14 months he'd been saving. The double shifts, the skipped groceries, the birthday present he still hadn't bought because the account balance said not yet. Same as the month before. Same as the month before that. He was thinking about the number in his savings account. $63,000 and change. An amount of money he'd never had at once in his life. Money he did not let himself think of as his own, because it belonged to a surgery, belonged to Wren, was already spent in every way that mattered, even if the hospital hadn't yet received it. He was thinking about what $60,000 meant in practical terms. 2 more years, maybe. 18 months if the estate work kept coming in, if the weekends stayed busy, if nothing broke on the truck. And then a billionaire with everything pointed at a rusty car and laughed. Stay with this story tonight. Drop a comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far this one reaches. Hargrove House sat on 11 acres of Connecticut hill country, the way old money always does, like it had simply grown there, like the land had decided to arrange itself in deference. The driveway was crushed stone, 1/4 mile long, lined with birch trees that had been planted before anyone currently alive could remember planting them. The house itself was 3 stories of fieldstone and dark timber, built in the 20s by a man who had wanted permanence and had gotten it. Tall windows. A wraparound porch. The particular settled authority of a place that had never needed to announce itself. Nate had driven up at 6 that morning in his work truck, toolboxes rattling in the bed, because the estate manager had called 3 days before about a mechanical evaluation for the vehicle lot. Standard work, the kind Nate had done a dozen times for estate sales in Connecticut and western Massachusetts. Verify engine condition, note obvious damage, give the executor a fair market range for the auction sheet. Half a day's work, maybe, depending on the lot. Day rate plus mileage. He hadn't expected the house to be this large. He hadn't expected the driveway to be full of catering vans. The estate manager, a round, nervous man named Boyd, met him at the service entrance with an apologetic expression that suggested someone hadn't communicated clearly with someone else. Ms. Hargrove moved the viewing up, Boyd said. He had the voice of a man who spent most of his professional life managing other people's poor decisions. There are guests. She's doing a kind of preview event. Brunch. She wants the cars visible for atmosphere. Atmosphere, Nate looked past him at the grounds. White tents had been set up on the east lawn, the fabric tugging slightly in an October wind. Linen tablecloths, flowers, the specific geometry of an event designed to look effortless despite costing a significant sum. Women in shoes that cost more than his monthly rent were stepping carefully across gravel and heels, one hand out for balance. Men in sport coats who had the particular ease of people who had never had a reason to hurry were standing in small clusters with glasses in their hands, discussing things that didn't matter. "I can come back," Nate said. "She'd prefer you stayed," Boyd said. "She needs the appraisal notes by noon for the auction catalog." Nate picked up his clipboard, followed Boyd through a side door that went through the kitchen, stainless steel, catering staff moving around each other in that practiced way of people who did this for a living, and out through a corridor to the garages. There were 4 bays. 3 had doors standing open. The 4th was closed. He started with the open ones. A 1983 Mercedes 380 SL in champagne silver. Beautiful condition, original paint, service records in a manila envelope tucked into the glove box, mileage low enough to suggest it had been driven carefully and garaged. The kind of car a man of a certain generation had bought because it made him feel a particular way. Fair market $15,000 to $22,000, depending on the auction room. A 1971 Cadillac DeVille convertible in white with a red interior that had been replaced once cleanly. Someone had loved this car, you could tell. The chrome had been polished not long ago. The carpets had no wear patterns that would indicate neglect. Probably a driver car. Kept for occasions. $25,000 to $35,000. A pair of Jaguars. An Exca coupe from 1972 that needed sorting but had its original numbers matching drivetrain. And a sedan from a few years later that was in honest daily driver condition. The coupe wanted work, but the bones were right. The sedan was what it was. He noted everything carefully. Wrote his condition assessments in the specific shorthand he'd developed over years of doing this. Moved through the lot methodically. And then he lifted the canvas tarp on the car in the closed 4th bay. Boyd had let him in there, unlocking the side door and giving him the flashlight from the shelf by the switch when the overhead lights turned out to be dead. 3 bulbs. All burned. The 4th bay smelled different from the others. Older, more layered. The particular scent of a space that had been closed for a very long time. The tarp had its own coat of dust. Nate almost walked past the car entirely. The lot had 5 items accounted for. He'd assumed he was done. He lifted the tarp because he was thorough and because it was on his clipboard as item 6. He lifted it. He stood there. The rust was severe on the lower panels. Long, spreading tide marks where moisture had gotten in. Probably decades of it. The kind of deterioration that happened when a car was stored without climate control and not moved. The paint was wrong. Someone had sprayed it dark green over something else. The original color still visible at the edges in certain light. And the green job was a brush and roll amateur job. The kind you did to stop something from looking worse in photographs, or to obscure something specific. The hood had a 1/4-inch gap on the driver's side, where it didn't sit square. The passenger door had a ding that had been addressed 3 different times with body filler, each attempt slightly misaligned. Like someone had kept trying and kept failing. The windshield had a crack running diagonally from the lower right corner up toward the center. But the shape didn't lie. He set the flashlight down and walked around the front of the car slowly. His hand found the edge of the driver's door. He pulled it open. The hinges were stiff, but they moved. 40-some years of disuse, and they still moved. And he leaned in. The interior was ruined. The vinyl was cracked to the point of crumbling. The steering wheel had been replaced with something generic, a black aftermarket unit that didn't belong. The carpet had rotted, dried, rotted again. The door panels had delaminated. The dash had 2 cracked gauges and a 3rd that was missing entirely. He didn't look at any of that. He looked at the door jamb, the VIN plate, the small stamp tag that someone always forgot. In the world of automotive fraud, and there was a world of it, because the numbers involved made the effort worthwhile, The first thing a fraudster changed was the visible identification. The dashboard tag, the door panel tag, the windshield tag. These were the obvious ones, the ones inspectors looked at, the ones insurance companies photographed. But the door jamb plate was harder, recessed deeper, obscured by the door itself when open, invisible when closed. And it was stamped from the factory, not applied, the VIN characters pressed into the metal itself, not on a piece of metal attached to the metal. You couldn't fake it without replacing the entire door jamb section, which meant you couldn't fake it without leaving evidence of the replacement. The plate in the Hargrove garage had no evidence of replacement. It had the clean, precise factory stamps of something original. Nate looked at the VIN for a long time. Then he straightened up, walked to the front, opened the hood. The hinges on the hood were stiffer. It took 2 hands and a firm lift, but it opened. He shone the flashlight at the firewall. The stamp was there. He stood very still. Outside the garage, he could hear the guests on the lawn, the drift of conversation and music and someone's polished laughter. He could hear Boyd walking back and forth somewhere in the outer bay, probably on his phone. He closed the hood, carefully, like it needed to be treated gently. Not because it was fragile, it wasn't. It was built to be driven flat out on a racing circuit in 1966, but because something in him wanted to. He went back to his clipboard. For item 6, he wrote, requires closer inspection. Will advise. 4 words that would, in the end, change everything. Boyd reappeared at the door, phone in hand, the apologetic expression firmly back in place. Miss, Hargrove would like you on the lawn. For the walkthrough. She wants to present the vehicles to the guests. Nate looked at the tarp. He'd pulled it back. He folded it forward the way he'd found it, covered the car again. Sure, he said. He followed Boyd back into the light. Nate had been an auto restoration mechanic for 11 years, working out of a shop in Waterbury that occupied the first floor of a building he rented from an older man named George, who kept the upstairs as storage and came by once a month to pick up the check and talk about things that interested him. The shop had 2 lifts, 1 alignment rack, a spray booth he used more for primer work than finish painting, and a wall of diagnostic equipment that represented 3 years of careful purchases at the kind of prices you found when you knew where to look and were patient enough to wait for the right moment. It was honest work. It was good work. He was genuinely skilled at it, not just the mechanical side, which was standard enough for a man who'd grown up in garages, but the identification side, the understanding of what something was and what it was worth and what it had been through, the forensic reading of a car's history that distinguished real expertise from mere competence. Most people who brought him their cars didn't know about the other part of his background. There was no reason for them to. He looked like what he was, a mechanic in a mid-sized Connecticut city, 41 years old, lean in the way people got when they spent their days using their bodies for work and didn't think much about it. His hands were permanently stained at the nail beds, with the trace evidence of his profession regardless of how carefully he washed them. He drove a truck that needed new shocks and a tailgate latch that actually latched. He ate lunch from a cooler he packed in the morning. He was polite without being warm to people he didn't know, and warm without being demonstrative to people he did. He did not look like someone who had spent 4 years as a junior consultant at Sotheby's automotive division, authenticating classic American muscle cars for private collectors, insurance companies, and auction houses. He did not look like someone who had sat across tables from collectors who had more money than some small countries, who had examined cars worth millions with the calm dispassion of a doctor reviewing test results, who had once declined to certify a vehicle for private sale because of a single mismatched chassis stamp that 3 other appraisers had missed. He had co-written 3 field reports on Shelby Cobra authentication methodology that were still cited by other appraisers. He had testified in 2 federal fraud cases as an expert witness. He had identified 4 fraudulent title vehicles that had been attempting to pass through the legitimate market. in each case catching something small and specific that the forgers had not known to worry about. He'd left that world when Wren was born, and he'd left it by choice, not necessity. The Sotheby's work paid significantly better, but it required travel, sometimes extensive travel, and it operated in a world that Nate had never quite felt was his world. The clients were collectors, dealers, the kinds of wealthy enthusiasts who approached vintage cars as investments first and machines second. The world of million-dollar authentication was a world of luxury hotels and private aviation and client dinners at restaurants where nothing had a price on the menu, and Nate had navigated it competently enough. But it had always felt like a suit that didn't quite fit. His daughter was going to need someone present, someone who came home at the same time every day, someone whose phone wasn't ringing at midnight because a collector in Dubai needed a second opinion on a purchase before the auction house's 48-hour deadline. He had made the transition without regret. But the knowledge was still there. The way knowledge always is, not something you chose to keep, just something that stayed because it was part of how you saw the world now. The patterns were in his eyes, permanent as the oil stains on his hands. He knew, standing in the fourth bay of the Hargrove garage with Boyd's footsteps receding toward the house, exactly what he'd just seen. A 1966 Shelby Cobra 427 Super competition. The SC was the rarest configuration of the rarest configuration. Carroll Shelby had built the Cobra as a racing machine from the beginning. A lightweight English act body married to increasingly powerful Ford V8 engines. The whole project designed to embarrass Ferrari on both sides of the Atlantic. The 427 had been the most brutal version. A 7.0-liter engine in a car that weighed barely 1,000 kilograms, a machine so physically demanding to drive that even experienced racing drivers spoke of it with a particular kind of wary respect. But the SC, the Super competition, was the version built to a different specification entirely. The body was aluminum, not fiberglass. The chassis was a revised tubular frame. The suspension was reconfigured for the demands of endurance racing. The engine was built to a higher output specification than the standard 427. Shelby's shop had produced exactly 31 of them. 31 cars. In the years since, a handful had been destroyed in accidents. Several had been heavily modified by owners who hadn't fully understood what they had. One had burned in a collector's garage fire. The surviving original examples were among the most sought-after and valuable American automobiles ever built. The last authenticated SC that had passed through auction, a car in significantly worse original condition with a replaced windshield and a chassis that had been repaired following a racing incident, had sold for $7,800,000 at Barrett-Jackson, Phoenix, 3 years earlier. The car under the Hargrove tarp had a better VIN match, an uncut firewall, a door jamb plate that showed no evidence of replacement. This was not a numbers game you did in your head and moved on from. This was the kind of recognition that rearranged the room. Nate had not told Boyd any of this. He had not told anyone. Because he understood the practical reality of what he'd found. He was a contracted appraiser, hired to assess condition and provide fair market ranges for a catalog. He had no legal claim to this car. His job was to do the work he'd been hired to do. If he identified the car correctly and submitted those findings, the estate would handle it through whatever channels estates used: specialist auction, private sale, dealer consignment, and Nate would go home with his day rate. But when Boyd had walked him back from the garage toward the main house, Nate had noticed something. The corner of the tarp had been cut, not frayed. A clean diagonal cut, the kind made with scissors or a box knife. And underneath that corner, barely visible in the garage light, the edge of a red inventory sticker. Estate inventory stickers were applied during the cataloging process. They recorded the date of assessment, the assessor's ID code, and the assigned category. They were the paper trail that proved an item had been evaluated. Red meant disposal designation. Red meant the item had already been assessed, assigned a category, and designated for the low-value lot, the auction tier that handled items valued under a few $1,000s. Items in the red category didn't get specialist sale treatment. They went to the general auction, mixed in with furniture and household goods and the accumulated ordinary debris of a life ending. Someone had already looked at this car. Someone had already decided what it was. And they had been catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. Nate needed to see the estate paperwork. He needed to understand when the inventory had been done, who had done it, and what qualification that person had held. He needed to know whether the existing inventory designation had legal standing. He needed to do all of this quietly, without signaling what he knew. He carried that knowledge through the rest of the morning like something fragile, walking with it through the catered brunch, through Boyd's tour of the vehicle lot, through the moment when Celeste Hargrove had introduced the cars to her guests with the offhand explanations of someone who had never particularly cared about any of them. He had made it through all of that without saying anything. And then, she'd gotten to item 6. She'd pulled back the tarp herself, a theatrical gesture, the host's instinct for drama, and swept her arm toward the rusted shape with a grin. And this one, she'd said, I'm told is actually registered. Title and everything. God knows why my father kept it. Dad had terrible taste. She'd looked around at her guests with the performer's instinct for audience. Anyone want a project? Mister, Calloway here was just saying it's basically parts value. Weren't you, Mr. Calloway? He had not been saying that. He had said, requires closer inspection. The guests had laughed. Someone had said something about welding the bumper back on, which got another laugh. And then Celeste had turned to him with that brilliant, practiced smile and said, take it. Really, you're already here. You've got the truck. Take it home. Maybe you can melt it down for something useful. The guests had laughed again. And Nate Calloway, who held in his head the knowledge of exactly what sat under that tarp and exactly what it was worth, had looked at Celeste Hargrove and said, are you sure? Which was not what he'd meant to say. He'd meant to deflect, to say something neutral and come back to this through proper channels, through Sandra's legal advice, through the careful and methodical process he'd already begun assembling in his mind. But she'd waved her hand, already turning back to her guests. Take it. Consider it payment for coming out on a Saturday. Boyd will do the paperwork. Boyd had looked at Nate with the careful blankness of a man who was paid not to have opinions. Ms. Hargrove, Nate said quietly, I want to make sure this is properly documented. Oh, Boyd'll handle it. She was already moving away. Glass raised toward a cluster of guests across the lawn. He handles everything. Nate looked at Boyd. Boyd looked at Nate. I'll draw up a transfer form, Boyd said. I'd like a copy of the existing inventory documentation for the vehicle as well, Nate said. For my records. Boyd hesitated. I'll see what I can do. It took 4 hours. Nate sat in his truck in the parking area and waited, because leaving would have meant leaving the car, and he was not leaving the car. Boyd brought him a transfer form and a copy of the inventory sheet, which Nate read in the truck with his reading glasses on and his coffee going cold. The inventory assessment had been done by a man named Peter Lund, designated on the form as Estate Asset Handler, Hargrove Associates. No professional certifications listed. No automotive qualifications. His assessment of item 6, vehicle, vintage, heavy deterioration. No engine condition verified. Condition assessment, fair to poor. Market value estimation, $800, $1,200. Scrap/parts, $800 to $1,200. That was the official estate valuation of a 1966 Shelby Cobra 427 SC. Nate sat there for a moment, looking at the number. Then he called Diane Kroll. Wren had been diagnosed at 3 years and 4 months old. The diagnosis had come after a year of Nate and his then-wife Lauren noticing something they couldn't quite name. Not a dramatic absence of response. Nothing so clear or alarming as that. Just a subtle pattern of slightly delayed reactions. A habit of watching faces very intently. The way she seemed to hear some sounds perfectly and others not at all. Their pediatrician had referred them to an audiologist almost as a precaution, expecting to rule something out. The audiologist had not ruled it out. Moderate to severe bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Both ears. The kind that originated in the inner ear, in the hair cells of the cochlea that translated sound waves into neural signals. The kind that couldn't be corrected with tubes or surgery on the middle ear. The kind that hearing aids helped, but didn't fix. The audiologist had explained it carefully, professionally, with the measured kindness of someone who gave this information regularly and had learned to do it well. Wren was too young to understand what was being discussed. She sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table with a plastic duck she'd found in a basket of waiting room toys, turning it over in her hands with complete concentration. Nate had listened to the explanation without interrupting. He'd asked the questions he needed to ask. He'd thanked the audiologist. He'd taken the written materials she offered. He'd strapped Wren into her car seat, started the truck, driven exactly 4 blocks, and then pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store and sat there with his hands on the wheel for 10 minutes, not doing anything. Lauren had sat in the passenger seat. They hadn't talked. He didn't know what she'd felt in that parking lot. They'd never discussed it. 8 months later, she'd gone to Portland, and that particular conversation, like a lot of other conversations from that period, had never happened. What he'd felt in the parking lot was a specific kind of fear, not panic, not grief exactly, but the particular fear of someone who has just discovered that the work ahead is different in kind from the work they'd been doing, that everything he'd been planning about how this was going to go had just changed, that a new kind of attention was required. He'd been good at the new kind of attention. He'd been, he thought, genuinely good at it. Wren was now 7. She was in 2nd grade at Jefferson Elementary in Waterbury, a school with good teachers and, as mentioned, terrible acoustics, high ceilings, hard floors. The echo patterns of a building designed in an era when nobody thought about such things. Her teacher, a patient woman named Miss Reeve, had taken 2 hours of her own weekend to read through the accommodation materials the audiologist had provided. She'd rearranged the classroom seating twice until she found the arrangement that worked best for Wren. Wren had figured out, mostly on her own, 100 small adaptations for moving through a world built for ears that worked differently from hers. She sat at the end of the lunch table nearest the wall, because the wall reflected sound in a way that helped. She'd developed a habit of positioning herself slightly to the left of whoever she was talking to, angling her better ear toward them, so naturally that people rarely noticed she was doing it. She was an exceptionally good reader of faces and contexts, filling in the sounds she missed with logic and inference. She never complained about any of this. That was the thing. Kids complained. 7-year-olds complained about everything: being hungry, being bored, being tired, being required to do things they didn't want to do. It was developmentally appropriate, and Nate understood this and had no particular problem with it. But Wren did not complain about her hearing. She had never, as far as he knew, complained about it. She just worked around it. Adjusted, figured out what worked, and did that. He thought about that a lot. About what it cost her to be that good at adapting. About whether the adaptation itself became a kind of burden. The daily effort of a child who had to think about things that other children never thought about. The surgery, bilateral cochlear implant, the procedure the audiologist had recommended at their last appointment, and the one before that, would not restore perfect hearing. Nothing would restore perfect hearing, but the results in children Wren's age were consistently, reliably excellent. The majority of pediatric cochlear implant recipients achieved functional hearing that allowed them to follow normal conversation, listen to music, talk on the phone. To stop working so hard. $120,000. His savings account held $63,000 at the time he drove up the Hargrove driveway. The number was precise enough to be a taunt. Exactly halfway. Not a minor shortfall, not a matter of a few extra months, a full year and a half of additional saving at his current rate, possibly more. 18 months of Wren, sitting at the end of the lunch table, angling her ear toward the sound. The inventory sheet was still in his glove compartment when he made it home that evening. Boyd had given him the transfer paperwork along with a title, a Connecticut title, yellowed at the edges, the vehicle identification number matching the door jamb plate, the registration listing the original purchase date as 1966, and a chain of subsequent owners that ended, long ago, with one James Hargrove, who had purchased the car at a private estate sale in 1978 and who was listed as the last registered owner, James Hargrove, Celeste's late father, who had bought a car at an estate sale in 1978 and then, apparently, put it in his garage and not moved it again. Nate had the paperwork spread on his kitchen table when Wren came home from school. She had mud on one knee. She had mud on one knee most Fridays, some ritual that he'd never fully investigated, and she dropped her backpack by the door and came to the kitchen for a snack. "What's all that?" she said. "Work stuff." She poured herself a glass of juice and looked at the papers from a polite distance, respecting the boundary while being openly curious about it. Good work stuff or bad work stuff? He thought about how to answer that. "I'm not sure yet." Okay. She took her juice to the table and started on her reading homework, which was about ocean animals. She kept her finger under the words as she read, not because she needed to, she was a fluent reader, but because it was a habit she'd developed, a tactile anchor that helped her concentrate when other things were competing for her attention. He watched her for a while. He thought about $60,000. He thought about a car sitting in a garage with the right VIN numbers and the wrong inventory tag. He thought about doing this exactly right. He opened his laptop and pulled up the Sotheby's Automotive Archive, the section he'd helped build during his time there, and found the authentication report he'd co-authored on Cobra SC chassis identification. He read it twice. He pulled up the comparative sale records for every documented SC transaction in the last 15 years. He built a timeline of the surviving examples, cross-referencing what was publicly known about each car. Then, he called Diane. The call lasted 40 minutes. She asked good questions. He gave her precise answers. He sent the VIN photographs he'd taken on his phone and the close-up images of the firewall stamp. She called back 11 minutes after receiving them. "I need to see it in person," she said. "Tuesday?" "Tuesday," he wrote Tuesday on the notepad by the phone. He closed the laptop. He made dinner, pasta, something simple, the kind of meal he could make while thinking about other things. Wren set the table without being asked, the way she'd started doing since school had taught her about responsibility, and they ate together and she told him about the ocean animals' homework, and he told her nothing about any of the things he was thinking. After dinner, after the dishes, after the bedtime routine that they had refined over years into something efficient and also good, teeth, pajamas, the story she still wanted, the nightlight that she claimed was for Chester the stuffed dog but was really for her, he sat at the kitchen table again with the inventory sheet in front of him. $800 to $1,200. He turned the paper over. On the back was blank. He wrote on it, Peter Lund, estate asset handler. What are the Connecticut probate requirements for specialty asset valuation? He wrote the name of Elliot Marsh's wife. He'd met her twice, briefly at Elliot's shop when she'd stopped by. She'd left her card both times. He still had one. Sandra Marsh. Probate and estate litigation. He put the card on top of the inventory sheet. He would call her in the morning. Tuesday came cold and bright, the kind of October morning in Connecticut that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Diane Kroll arrived at the Hargrove property at 7:45 minutes before Nate, which was typical of her. When Nate pulled up, Boyd was already standing outside the fourth bay with the particular expression of a man caught between two sets of instructions he didn't fully understand. Diane was inside, kneeling by the passenger sill with a flashlight, her silver hair pulled back under a knit cap, reading glasses balanced at the end of her nose, completely ignoring Boyd the way an expert ignored anything that wasn't the work. "There you are," she said, without looking up. "Good morning. Come look at this." She had her own equipment, a second flashlight, a magnifying loupe, a digital borescope with a flexible cable that she used for tight spaces, a reference binder of factory production documentation that she carried in a hard-sided case. She'd been in the automotive authentication business for 22 years. She'd published in 2 trade journals. She'd testified in federal court. She had the specific, unhurried authority of someone who had been wrong before, had learned from it, and had then spent 2 decades being right. She moved the flashlight to the lower door jamb, angling the light sharply across the surface. "Stampings are original," she said. "No evidence of transplant. See the edge tool marks here?" She shifted the light 2 inches. "The impression geometry is consistent with original factory application at Shelby's San Jose facility. Factory stamps have a specific depth profile because of the die pressure used. Transplanted plates, even good ones, show slightly different edge geometry because the die pressure against the new parent metal behaves differently. I noticed the same thing," Nate said. "And here." She moved to the firewall, opened the hood with practiced efficiency. "The casting date code." "What's the offset?" He read it. Did the mental arithmetic he'd done a dozen times since Saturday, 11 weeks before the build date. That's tight, but within spec for the SC production run. The standard 427s were running longer lead times in early '66. The SC run was expedited because of the racing schedule. She straightened up. "It's consistent. I'd want to verify with the Shelby registry documentation, but I'm not seeing anything that contradicts authenticity." She went around the car with a methodical patience that was slightly different from Nate's own approach. Less intuitive, more systematic, more formally documented. She photographed everything. She noted every measurement. She used the borescope to examine portions of the chassis that were otherwise inaccessible. She spent 20 minutes on the firewall alone. Boyd, after his 3rd attempt to politely interject, had given up and was standing near the door with his arms crossed, watching them the way you watched people doing work you didn't understand. "What are you 2 actually saying?" he asked, when they'd been at it long enough that his patience had outweighed his instructions to stay quiet. They looked at each other. Diane raised an eyebrow. A question, not a statement. "Your call. The existing estate inventory assessment isn't accurate for this vehicle," Nate said. Boyd absorbed this. "How inaccurate?" "Significantly, like, what does that mean, significantly?" Diane had crouched down again, examining the lower rocker panel. "It means the car should not have been assessed at scrap value," she said, without looking up. "What should it have been assessed at?" No one answered that. Boyd's phone rang. He answered it, moved toward the door, spoke in a low voice that Nate could hear perfectly well. "Yes, they're here." "No, I don't know exactly. They're saying the car is. The appraisal is wrong somehow. I'm not sure what that means." Yes, I'll tell them." He came back. "Ms. Hargrove would like to speak with you." The call with Celeste, when it came, was brief. She was brisk and professionally pleasant in a way that suggested she'd been briefed by someone and had decided on a tone. "I understand there may be a discrepancy in the vehicle assessment. I'm sure we can clear this up quickly. I'd recommend an independent professional appraisal," Nate said, "with documentation submitted to the probate court." A pause. "That sounds like more process than we need for a scrap vehicle." "Depends on what the vehicle turns out to be," he said. Another pause, slightly longer. "I'll have James, Mr. Renner, look into it." That was the last relaxed conversation either of them had for a while. Renner arrived at the property the next morning, and whatever Boyd had told him about the appraisal discrepancy had clearly been translated through someone who understood the potential magnitude. Because Renner arrived with the specific kind of prepared efficiency of an attorney who had already decided what was going to happen. The consulting agreement. Nate had read it again the night before, slowly looking for the specific language Renner was going to use. He'd found it in paragraph 7, subsection 3, which was written in the particular dense legalese that people used when they wanted something to be overlooked. Any material findings, assessments, or determinations made by the consulting appraiser regarding the nature, identity, condition, or value of estate assets shall become the exclusive property of the estate, and the consulting appraiser hereby waives any independent interest in or claim based upon such findings. Renner cited it with the smooth delivery of someone who expected it to close the discussion. It didn't. I haven't submitted a formal assessment, Nate said. Renner's delivery paused for exactly 1 second. I'm sorry? I submitted a partial condition report. I noted that item 6 required further inspection. I specifically did not submit a formal assessment for item 6 because I determined further inspection was required. My formal findings for that item are incomplete. Diane, standing at his side, said nothing. She had the expression of someone who had just watched a chess move she hadn't anticipated. The clause governs material findings, Nate said. If I haven't submitted findings, the clause has no subject to govern. Renner was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a very competent attorney who was rapidly revising his morning's plan. The clause also governs informal assessments and determinations, he said. I'll need to review that with my own counsel, Nate said. Renner's eyes shifted very slightly. He'd expected a mechanic who would read the consulting agreement as binding and step back. He was revising his model in real time. The inventory assessment currently on file with the probate court is valid and was completed according to standard estate procedure, he said. Any challenge to that assessment would require filing a formal challenge with the probate court, Nate said. I'm aware. Celeste, who had been standing slightly behind Renner, spoke for the first time. Mr. Calloway, you were hired to assess vehicle condition for a catalog. You've complicated a straightforward estate process. I identified a potential material error in an estate inventory, he said. That's not something I can overlook. Why not? He thought about how to answer that, about what was true and what was also true. Because the car is worth about $9 million, he said. And if the estate sells it as scrap, everyone involved, including you, has a serious problem. The stillness that followed was the particular stillness of a room adjusting to a number. Celeste looked at Renner. Renner looked at the ground. Boyd, who had heard everything, was standing very still near the door with the expression of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. I'll be in contact with my attorney, Nate said. He walked to his truck. He drove out the long birch-lined driveway. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He called Sandra Marsh before he'd gotten 2 miles down the road. I need that intake meeting moved to today, he said. I have a deposition at 2, she said. Tonight, then. A pause. How serious? Very serious. She moved things around. He went to her office at 6. He brought the inventory sheet, the consulting agreement, the transfer paperwork, the VIN photographs, and Diane's preliminary notes. He spread them on Sandra's conference table and walked her through each one. Sandra read everything carefully, methodically, making notes in the margin of her own copy. The inventory assessor, she said. Peter Lund, do you know if he has any automotive certification? I don't know for certain. The form doesn't list any. Connecticut Probate Code has specific requirements for specialty asset valuation. Vehicles with potential collectible value above a certain threshold are supposed to be assessed by certified professionals. She looked at the form. A general estate handler isn't automatically excluded from doing an initial catalog. But if the asset is later found to be a specialty item that required certified appraisal, and a Shelby Cobra would certainly qualify, the existing valuation may not hold up under challenge. That's what I was thinking. You'd need to establish that it is, in fact, what you believe it to be. Authentication documentation. Diane's report will be complete by the end of next week. And the consulting agreement. Sandra had her reading glasses on, going through paragraph 7. The language here is boilerplate. I've seen it before. It's designed for standard estate appraisals, where the appraiser is being paid to assess items and hand the findings to the estate, not for situations where the appraiser has independent standing as a party. The clause about findings becoming estate property works fine when findings are submitted. When findings are withheld pending further investigation, she made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. There's a legitimate argument that no findings exist yet for purposes of this clause. That's what I told Renner. She looked at him. You know estate law. I know that I didn't submit a completed assessment. The distinction may be consequential. She closed the folder. If you want to file a formal challenge to the inventory assessment, I can prepare the motion. We'd be asking the probate court to require a proper specialty asset appraisal for item 6. If the car is what you believe it to be, the court orders a certified appraisal, the appraisal confirms authenticity, and the estate inventory has to be corrected. And the car goes through normal estate asset process, correctly valued, which means it gets sold at proper market value, not scrap value. She paused. Your standing to challenge comes from the fact that you are a contracted appraiser who identified a potential material inaccuracy and was prevented from completing your assessment. That's a legitimate basis. What about the consulting agreement? I'll draft the argument. The clause is defensible, but we'll need to account for it. I want to see how Renner's office interprets it under challenge. His letter is probably where we find out if they actually believe their own position or if they were just hoping you'd back down. She said the word hoping with the specific inflection of someone who already had an opinion on which it was. One more thing, she said. You should know that filing this challenge will not be quiet. Estate disputes are public record. The authentication report, if it confirms what you believe, will become part of the court record. The number will become public. I know. Celeste Hargrove has attorneys, family connections, and presumably feels entitled to determine what happens with her father's estate. She is not going to enjoy this process. I understand. Are you prepared for that? He thought about Ren eating cereal with one hearing aid in, about the surgery estimate in his glove compartment, about the red inventory sticker on the tarp corner, and the $800 Peter Lund had written on a form that was worth $9 million in error. Yes, he said. Sandra nodded once. All right, let me draft the motion. Give me 48 hours. The weeks between Sandra's filing and the court hearing were a kind of sustained tension that Nate had not experienced before. He went to work every day. He changed oil and replaced brake pads and diagnosed the specific ailments of the ordinary cars that people brought him. And he did it carefully and correctly, because that was what the work deserved regardless of what else was going on. He ate lunch from his cooler. He picked Ren up from school. He made dinner and helped with homework and read bedtime stories and said goodnight. The ordinary surface held. Underneath it, everything was moving. There were phone calls he had to make that he didn't want to make. His brother Paul in New Hampshire, who was the only family member who knew about Ren's surgery timeline and had been following it with the particular loyal, practical interest of a person who cared and was too far away to help practically. Nate called him not to ask for anything, but because Paul was the kind of person who needed to be kept informed, who took being left out of important things as a personal slight that would surface later in unexpected ways. How's it looking? Paul asked. Good, I think, Nate said. Maybe. The legal part is complicated. What legal part? You said it was an estate appraisal. So he'd explained. All of it. The tarp, the VIN, the inventory tag, the credit facility, Renner, the probate challenge. Paul listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, which meant he understood the stakes. So it's actually $9 million, Paul said when he was done. That's what Diane's report says. Nate, I know. That's $9 million. I know. Are you okay? It was a strange question for the circumstances, but also the right question. I don't know what I am. Nate said honestly. I'm trying to keep doing the work in front of me. The legal work. The actual shop work. I'm trying not to think about the number too much, because if I think about it too much, I stop being able to function. Paul was quiet for a moment. What does Ren know? She knows I'm working on something. She knows it might be good news. She knows I'm not sure yet. She's going to be fine, Paul said. She's always been fine, I know. And she's going to hear you calling her name from the next room. His throat closed. Yeah, so do the legal work. Do the shop work. Take it one piece at a time. That was the advice. That was the only advice that worked. He did the legal work. He did the shop work. He picked up Ren from school at 3 o'clock every day and walked with her through the neighborhood that hadn't changed, past the grocery store and the laundromat and the small park where she still liked to stop at the climbing structure, even though she was technically a bit old for it. She would climb to the top platform and stand there for a moment, looking out over the neighborhood with the particular proprietary satisfaction of a person who has gained a height. What do you see? He asked one afternoon, standing below her. She shielded her eyes with her hand in an exaggerated gesture. The whole city, she said. It's not a city, he said. It's a neighborhood. The whole neighborhood, then. She considered this. And the top of the hardware store. That's accurate. She climbed back down. They kept walking. He thought about that a lot in the weeks of the legal proceedings. The view from up high. The way something looked different when you were in the right position to see it. The car in the fourth bay had been in the same place for 40 years. James Hargrove had presumably walked past it on the way to his other cars, or to storage, or through on his way to something else. He'd have seen the tarp. He'd have seen what was under the tarp. But not everyone who looked at something saw what they were seeing. That was the whole truth of the situation, really. Not fraud, not genius, not luck. Just the specific knowledge that let one person see a thing for what it actually was. He'd spent 4 years building that knowledge at Sotheby's. He'd built it before that, in his father's garage, in the wrecking yards he'd haunted as a teenager, in the years of reading and looking and asking questions of people who knew more than him. He'd built it without planning to use it for anything specific, without expecting that it would matter in the way it mattered. Some things waited, Ren would tell him later. They did. Sandra's paralegal, a young woman named Tess, who moved through legal databases the way mechanics moved through parts catalogs, fast and certain, had been pulling records on the Hargrove estate since the morning of Sandra's intake meeting. What she found, assembled piece by piece over the following 2 weeks, was something Nate had not anticipated. The estate had a credit facility. It had been established 18 months earlier, just over a year before James Hargrove's death. A private lending arrangement, not through a bank, through a firm called Arcadia Capital, that Sandra, when she looked at the corporate filings, described as a real estate vehicle with some structural creativity in its origins. The principal of Arcadia Capital was a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss had also been the best man at Celeste Hargrove's first wedding 7 years earlier. The terms of the credit facility were complex in the way that things are complex when the complexity is meant to obscure something. But the key provision, when Tess found it, was this: if the estate's total liquidation proceeds fell below a specified threshold, Arcadia Capital had the right of first refusal to purchase the Hargrove property, the 11 acres of Connecticut hill country, at a price fixed at 981% of the tax assessment value from 3 years prior, which was significantly below current market. The threshold had been set carefully. The vehicle lot, if it sold at the valuations on the original inventory, would have brought the estate's total proceeds to exactly $1.2 million below the trigger number. $1.2 million below. Nate sat with this for a long time, turning it over. It could have been coincidence. Estates were complex. Credit facilities were common. Estate liquidation was an imprecise science, and the threshold might have been set carelessly or conservatively. But it was also possible that someone had looked at the estate's assets, understood roughly what they would bring at proper market value, and then done something to make sure they didn't. An interior assessor with no automotive credentials. A red disposal tag. An $800 valuation on a $9 million car. It was possible that it was incompetence. It was also possible that it wasn't. Sandra brought this to Nate at their third meeting in her office, laying it out with careful precision, not characterizing it as fraud because she was a precise woman, and fraud was a word with specific legal requirements that she hadn't yet met. What I'm saying, she said, is that the financial architecture of this estate is structured in a way that would have benefited a specific connected party if the liquidation had proceeded at the original assessed values. And the most significant single asset, by a very large margin, was assessed in a way that is professionally indefensible. She didn't know, Nate said. He surprised himself by saying it. Sandra looked at him. What makes you say that? Because when I told her the car was worth $9 million, her reaction was genuine shock. She wasn't performing shock. She was actually shocked. He thought about Celeste's face in that moment, the way the social smoothness had cracked. Just briefly. She handed it to me as a joke. You don't give away $9 million as a joke if you know it's $9 million. People have given away larger things for stranger reasons. She wasn't acting. She was actually embarrassed. He paused. Someone else was managing this. Someone who knew what needed to happen for the threshold to be missed. Sandra considered this. Renner? Maybe Renner. Maybe Renner on behalf of Foss. Maybe Foss directly. He shook his head. Celeste Hargrove was dealing with a father's estate and inheritance taxes, and a property she didn't want to manage, and a credit arrangement her father had made that she probably didn't fully understand. She was in a hurry. She was under pressure. She trusted the people she'd hired. And they didn't tell her what the car was. They didn't tell her what the car was. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a generous interpretation. It's the one that fits the evidence, Nate said. She gave me the car. In front of 40 witnesses. You think someone would have tried to undo that? I think if Renner had known the car's value before I got involved, the transfer paperwork would never have been signed. The car would have disappeared into private hands somewhere. There would have been a story, destroyed in transport, title error, whatever. He looked at his hands. But nobody told Celeste what it was. So she gave it away. On a whim, in front of guests, to make them laugh. And now someone is trying to walk that back. Sandra made a note. She made several notes. She looked at the credit facility terms again. She called Tess and asked 3 questions and got 3 answers that seemed to confirm what she was thinking. I'm going to file a supplemental notice to the court, she said. Not an allegation of fraud. A request that the estate's credit facility arrangement be examined for its potential effect on the accuracy of the inventory process. It's within the scope of the original challenge. Will Renner see it coming? Renner is already watching everything we file. He'll see it the moment it hits the docket. She paused. But he can't prevent it. And once the court is looking at the connection between the credit facility and the inventory outcomes, it's not a conversation that stays quiet. She was right about it not staying quiet. She was also right that Renner couldn't prevent it. What happened next happened quickly. In the way that things move fast once the correct questions are in front of people whose job it is to find answers. The court appointed an independent estate administrator pending investigation. The administrator's first action was to place a freeze on all asset transfers pending a comprehensive review. The second action was to request Renner's full communication records with the estate for the previous 2 years. Renner resigned from the case 3 days later. His letter of withdrawal cited an irreconcilable conflict between counsel's ethical obligations and the direction the matter is taking, which Sandra read aloud to Nate over the phone in the tone of someone reading a very unconvincing excuse note from a middle schooler. Gerald Foss's firm, Arcadia Capital, retained its own counsel. The credit facility's trigger provision was immediately contested. There were emergency hearings. There were filings Nate couldn't follow without Sandra's help. There was a period of about 2 weeks when every phone call from Sandra began with her saying there's been a development in a voice that suggested this was one of approximately 4 developments that day. Nate went to work. He picked up Ren from school. He made dinner. He had told Ren as little as possible, which was the same thing he'd always told her when work was complicated. But she had the particular perception of a child who has spent her whole life reading context and filling in what she couldn't hear, and she knew something large was happening. She didn't push. She just kept her eyes on him with that clear, patient regard and waited. "Is the good thing still possible?" she asked one evening, out of nowhere while they were watching television. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." "Okay," she said, and went back to watching the screen. The certified appraisal hearing was on a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after Sandra's initial filing. It was a small courtroom in the Hartford Probate Division, wood paneling, fluorescent overhead light, a gallery of 6 seats that held the estate administrator's counsel, a reporter from a legal trade publication who had apparently been following estate fraud cases in Connecticut, and Boyd, who had come without being asked and sat in the last row with his coat still on. The judge was a man in his 60s named Warren, who had been doing probate work for long enough that nothing surprised him, and who appeared, from the quality of his attention, to have read every document in the file before sitting down. He asked Renner's replacement counsel 2 questions, and Sandra 3, and then he spent 7 minutes reading Diane's authentication report in complete silence, while both sides waited. Diane was present. She sat straight in the witness chair with her hands folded, the authentication binder open on the table in front of her, and answered questions with the specific measured precision of an expert who understood that every word she said would eventually become a footnote in something. Renner's replacement, a younger attorney named Gaines, who had the look of someone who had inherited a fire and was being paid to manage the smoke, argued that the existing inventory was procedurally valid and that any challenge to it was motivated by the consulting appraiser's personal financial interest in a higher valuation. Sandra let him finish. Then she put Diane's credentials on the record. 22 years. 2 published authentication studies. Federal court testimony. The Shelby Registry's formal acknowledgement of her methodology. Then the authentication report itself, 63 pages, each page a specific component of the case for the car's identity. Then the original assessor's qualifications. Peter Lund, estate asset handler, no automotive certifications, no professional membership in any recognized appraisal body, a general handler who had been assigned to inventory a garage. Then Connecticut Statute 45A 321, subsection 4, which specifically required certified professional assessment for collectible or specialty assets above a threshold value. The question before the court, Sandra said, is not whether the estate's process was well-intentioned. It may have been. The question is whether it met the evidentiary standard required by Connecticut law for assets of this category. It did not. And the consequence of that failure is that an asset potentially worth millions of dollars was designated for scrap sale. The court has a straightforward obligation here. Judge Warren looked at Gaines. Gaines said something about procedural good faith and established practice. Judge Warren looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he looked down at the authentication report again. He read for another 6 minutes. Then, the court finds that the original inventory assessment of Vehicle Item 6 does not meet the evidentiary standard required for specialty collectible assets under Connecticut Statute 45A 321, subsection 4. The valuation of $800 to $1,200 designated scrap is vacated. A certified independent appraisal will be completed within 21 days, conducted by a professional appraiser with recognized specialty certification in vintage American performance vehicles. Results will be filed with this court and used to correct the estate inventory accordingly. He picked up his pen. Any questions? Gaines had no questions. Sandra gathered her papers with the calm efficiency of someone who had expected this, but was not going to be obvious about having expected it. In the hallway outside, she allowed herself a single small nod. 21 days, Nate said. After that, the estate has to process the car through normal channels at the correct value. The credit facility trigger is already being examined separately. The Administrators' Council filed a notice yesterday. That will take longer, but it will resolve. She looked at him. You understand that the resolution may not give you the personal outcome you're hoping for. What do you mean? The car was transferred to you. That transfer is documented, it was witnessed, and the transfer paperwork was signed by Boyd under Celeste Hargrove's verbal direction. That's a valid transfer. She paused. But it was a transfer from an estate under active probate. The estate administrator may argue that any asset transferred from a probate estate after the estate entered the court's jurisdiction has to come back into the estate for proper distribution. He'd known this was a possibility. He'd known it since Sandra had first explained the legal landscape. And the court will weigh the circumstances. The transfer was done before the challenge was filed. It was done with the executor's explicit authorization. The executor was acting in her capacity as executor. Sandra looked at the ceiling for a moment. It's not straightforward. The administrator may want it returned, or the administrator may determine that honoring the original transfer is the correct outcome, particularly given that the transfer was what initiated the correct identification of the asset. What do you think the court will do? I think the court will look at who benefits from each outcome and what the equitable position is. She looked at him. You identified an asset that was about to be fraudulently or negligently mishandled. Your identification of that asset is the reason the estate has $9 million instead of $800. The court is not required to ignore that. 21 days passed. Diane submitted the formal appraisal. $9,200,000. Clean, documented, defensible under any challenge. The estate administrator filed a motion to resolve the question of the original transfer. There was another hearing. Sandra argued that the transfer had been made freely and verbally in front of witnesses, that it had been completed with proper documentation, and that vacating it now would reward the negligent or fraudulent processes that had created the problem in the first place. The estate's position, argued by the administrator, not Gaines, who had by this point found other things to do, was that all estate assets needed to go through proper probate distribution to protect the integrity of the estate process. Judge Warren looked at both sides. He asked Sandra 3 questions and the Administrators' Council 2. Then he said, the court finds that the transfer was made freely, in good faith with full documentation, prior to the filing of any formal challenge. The transfer stands. He picked up his pen. Any questions? Nate sat in the gallery and thought very carefully about what that meant. The car was his. The car was worth $9.2 million. The car was his. He called Sandra from the courthouse parking lot. She answered on the first ring, which was unusual for her in the middle of the day. How did it go? He vacated the inventory valuation, Nate said, ordered a certified appraisal within 21 days. A brief silence. Then, good. That's the right outcome. A pause. Are you okay? I think so. You did the work, she said. Every piece of it. The documentation, the standing argument, the patience to let the process move at its own speed instead of forcing it. Another pause. Go home. Take the rest of the day. He took the rest of the day. He picked Ren up from school, 3 o'clock. The afternoon rush of kids pouring through the doors with backpacks and noise. And they walked to the small park, and she climbed to the top of the climbing structure and stood there looking out over the neighborhood. You're in a good mood, she said, looking down at him. Maybe a little. She studied him the way she studied everything. Did the good thing happen? part of it. She absorbed this. Is the rest of it going to happen? I think so, he said. She nodded seriously. She climbed down. They walked home together in the thin afternoon light. He made dinner. Wren set the table and told him about the class project. Tapir muck animals, she was making a whale. She'd spent considerable time on the decision. He asked why a whale. She said because whales migrated, went really far, navigated by sound, could hear things from very far away. I thought that was interesting, she said. He looked at her. He thought about the hearing, about the judge reading 63 pages and arriving at the correct conclusion, because the evidence was complete and the argument was sound and the truth was what it was. Some things were worth the wait. He carried that through the rest of the evening, the ordinary rhythms of the apartment. Dishes. Television. The locks checked the way he always checked them, the quiet after she was in bed. Worth the wait. Worth the careful work. Worth every day of the 14 months, the surgery estimate in the glove compartment, the red inventory tag, the $800 error on the form. Worth all of it. The auction was held in January at a specialist house in New York that handled significant American performance cars and that Sandra had identified as the appropriate venue for a car of this category. The pre-auction estimate, published in the catalog and widely reported in the automotive and general press when news of the car's existence became fully public, was $8 to $12 million. The car sold at $9,400,000. 3 bidders had pushed past $9 million. The final price represented the second highest SC sale in documented history. Nate didn't attend. He watched the live stream at his kitchen table with Wren on his lap because she'd asked if she could stay up late to watch the auction, which she'd found out about from reading over his shoulder one evening when he'd had the auction house website open. He'd said yes, because he'd run out of reasons to say no to this particular thing. She fell asleep at 9:30, the bidding still going, her head dropping sideways onto his arm with the complete sudden unconsciousness of a child who has been awake past her limit. He turned the volume down. When the gavel came down at 9:23, at $9.4 million, she was breathing evenly against his shoulder. He texted Sandra, "Final price confirmed?" She texted back 9.4. "Congratulations, give me a few days to process the final disbursement calculation." He put his phone down. He looked at Wren's sleeping face. Chester the stuffed dog was wedged between her and the table, positioned as though supervising the auction. He thought about the car. He thought about James Hargrove putting it in a garage in 1978 and not telling anyone what it was. He thought about the canvas tarp collecting 40 some years of dust. He thought about the inventory sticker in red, disposal, scrap, $800, applied by a man who had looked at rust and bad paint and seen what the surface told him to see. He thought about Celeste. He'd met with her once more, in New Haven, at a coffee shop near Sandra's office. It had been her request. She'd arrived before him, as he'd expected she would, and she looked like a person who had been through something, not broken, but changed, the way a landscape changed after a flood receded. She hadn't apologized in an elaborate way. She'd simply said, "I didn't know." "I know," he'd said. "I should have known my own father's estate better. I should have read the credit facility terms. I should have had the cars properly assessed before she stopped. Before I gave them away as jokes. The inventory was wrong before you gave it away," he said. "You were working with bad information. Someone made sure I had bad information." Her jaw had tightened slightly. "Renner is cooperating with the investigation. Gerald's firm is going to be the subject of regulatory review." She looked at her coffee. "It wasn't what I thought it was. My father's estate. The arrangements." A pause. "My father set up the credit facility himself. He genuinely thought Gerald was a friend. He didn't understand what he'd agreed to. Are you going to be okay? Financially?" She looked at him, slightly surprised by the directness of it. "Yes, the estate, correctly valued, covers the inheritance taxes and the credit facility payoff and leaves me with a very substantial inheritance. Everything is different from what I expected, but not bad, just different." She paused again. "What about you?" He'd told her about Ren, the surgery, the timeline. She'd been quiet for a long moment after that. "When?" she said finally. "Third week of November." She nodded. She didn't offer anything, which he respected. She just acknowledged it. The way you acknowledge something that was serious and true. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday. The night before, they sat on the kitchen floor eating pizza from the box, because Ren had decided that was the right way to spend the evening. Blankets from the bedroom, Chester positioned between them, the specific contentment of a ritual they'd made up on the spot. The conversation was mostly about Ren's school project on migrations, birds, butterflies, the way living things moved toward what they needed, and about whether Chester would make a good migratory animal, which they decided he would not, because he was a stuffed dog and couldn't fly. "Are you scared?" Nate asked. She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "A little." "Are you?" "A lot," he said. She leaned into his shoulder. "But you'll still be there, right next to you." "Okay then," she said. The procedure took 4 hours and 12 minutes. Nate sat in the waiting room for all of it. He drank 2 cups of coffee he didn't want. He read 2 magazines without absorbing any of them. He called his mother and spoke for 12 minutes about nothing significant because he needed to hear someone's voice. He sat with his hands on his knees and waited. The surgeon came out with the expression of someone who had done this many times and had something good to report. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Recovery was a few days in the hospital. Quiet days. Ren slept a great deal, which was normal, which the nurses explained twice, which Nate understood intellectually and was still too worried to find comfortable. She ate hospital food and watched cartoons on the small screen above her bed and demanded to know when Chester could visit, which led to a brief negotiation with the nursing staff that resulted in Chester being deemed acceptable as a stuffed animal rather than a real animal. Activation happened 3 weeks later. The audiologist's office was small and had a plant on the windowsill and indirect lighting. There were 4 people in the room: the audiologist, a technician, Nate, and Ren. Chester was in Ren's lap. The audiologist explained what was going to happen. She explained it to both of them, looking at Ren at least as often as she looked at Nate, which he'd appreciated every single time this woman had done anything related to Ren's care. Then she turned on the implants. Ren's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, a slight opening of the eyes, a small catch of breath, then concentration, the familiar intense focus he knew so well. Then something else. Something he hadn't seen before in this specific form. Recognition, like finally here is the thing I knew should be there. She turned and looked at him. "I can hear you breathing," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. The room was very still. "Is that okay?" He managed. She smiled so wide it changed the whole room. "It's perfect," she said. The car completed its transfer to the auction house that same week. The paperwork went through Sandra's office, properly documented, with the authentication record attached, and the court's confirmation of valid transfer. Sandra submitted the final disbursement calculation 2 weeks after the auction. Nate's share, per the contingency agreement, 30% of net sale proceeds after auction house fees and court costs, $2,680,000. He sat on the shop floor when she told him the final number, because there was nowhere else to sit that seemed appropriate for the size of that information. The shop smelled of oil and rubber and metal, the same way it always had. The same bad overhead light in the second bay, the same crack in the concrete floor running from the east wall to just past the second lift. He sat there for a while. He called Ren's audiologist. He arranged the surgery fund transfer. $120,000 cleared from his account the next morning, directed to the hospital's billing department. and he sat at his kitchen table and watched the confirmation come through and felt the specific, wordless relief of something that had been held for a very long time finally being put down. He drove to the shop. He changed the oil in a 2017 Honda Accord that belonged to a woman named Patricia, who worked at the hospital 2 blocks away and had been bringing her cars to him for 4 years. He replaced a serpentine belt. He diagnosed a coolant leak. He went home. Ren was at school. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the ordinary mid-morning quiet of the house, and he thought about a car under a canvas tarp, and about 31 cars built to a standard no one else could meet, and about the particular stubbornness of truth, how it waited, patient and undeniable, until the right person showed up with the eyes to see it, not asking to be found, just there. 3 weeks after the surgery, on a morning when the weather was doing what November weather does in Connecticut, pressing cold and thin light through the windows, the sky the exact pale gray that meant snow was thinking about it, Ren came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning wearing pajamas and Chester under one arm and stood at the counter while Nate made coffee. She was listening to the coffee maker. He hadn't noticed her doing it until he turned around and saw her expression, head slightly tilted. The same look she'd had at activation. That look of a person who is receiving something and is taking it seriously. "What is it?" he said. "It makes a lot of sounds," she said. "I didn't know." He looked at the coffee maker. It did make a lot of sounds. The gurgling of the water heating, the hiss of steam, the drip and spatter of coffee hitting the carafe. He'd stopped hearing any of it years ago. "Good sounds or annoying sounds?" he asked. She thought about it. "Good, I think." A pause. "Some of them are annoying. The hissing part is annoying." "I agree about the hissing part." She set Chester on the counter. He was supervising the operation, and got down a bowl for cereal and went through the familiar morning geography of the kitchen, and Nate watched her and tried to be subtle about it, but was not subtle, because he was her father and she was the person who had learned to hear. "Stop staring," she said, without looking at him. "I'm not staring. You're definitely staring." "I'm observing," he said. "There's a distinction." She considered this. What's the distinction? Staring is when you're doing it and the other person can tell. Observing is when you're staring but you think you're being sneaky, she said. He poured his coffee. Maybe she ate her cereal standing at the counter, which she'd been doing lately. The audiologist had said this was common in newly activated children. The desire to stay mobile and in the middle of things rather than sitting in a fixed location. Nate didn't fully understand the mechanics of this, but recognized it as something alive in her, a new relationship to the space she moved through. He drank his coffee and thought about the first time she'd heard him call her name from another room. He'd been in the kitchen 2 weeks after activation, she'd been in the living room, and he'd called her name normally, not loudly, not performing it. Just Ren. She'd come to the doorway. "I heard that," she said. "Good," he said. She'd stood there for a moment, looking at him with that particular steadiness. "Do it again," she said. He called her name again. She listened. She nodded. "Again," she said. He called her name 4 more times, each time from a slightly different direction, a slightly different volume, and each time she tracked it with the focused attention of someone cataloging something important. When she'd heard enough, she went back to the living room and sat down and resumed what she'd been doing, and that was that. The experiment complete. The finding noted. He'd stood in the kitchen doorway for a while after that. The shop was the same. He hadn't moved, hadn't expanded, hadn't done anything in particular with the money beyond the surgery fund and a modest amount set aside for Ren's education and a slightly newer truck with functioning shocks and a tailgate that latched. He'd kept working. He liked the work. He was good at it, and it needed doing, and those 2 things together were sufficient reason to keep showing up. He'd had several inquiries about the authentication work, after the Cobra story became public in the automotive press. A few phone calls from collectors, a few from estate handlers who wanted him on their professional contact list. He'd taken 3 cases in the 6 months since, all of them legitimate estate work, none of them finding what the Hargrove garage had held. He'd also responded to Celeste's second email. The first had been 2 months after the auction, a note that was formal and brief and essentially thanked him for not making things worse than they already were, which he'd thought was a strange way to thank someone but understood the impulse behind. He'd replied with something similarly brief. The second came in December. She was reconsidering some decisions about the property. She'd had conversations with a land trust about placing the 11 acres under conservation protection, which would prevent the kind of development Arcadia Capital had been positioning for. She wanted to keep the house. She thought she might use it. My father wasn't a simple man, she wrote. He collected things without explaining them. He held on to the car for 30 years without telling me anything about it. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. I think maybe he didn't know himself. Nate had read this several times. He thought about James Hargrove buying a car at an estate sale in 1978. He thought about someone selling that car without knowing what it was, a mirror of the situation that had nearly played out 45 years later. He thought about Hargrove putting it in his garage and leaving it there for 30 years, through the building of his fortune, the raising of his daughter, the end of his life. Maybe he'd known exactly what it was and had kept it because it was the kind of thing you kept. Maybe he'd forgotten. People forgot things. Lives accumulated density, and particular objects got buried under the weight of other concerns. Maybe he'd meant to tell Celeste and hadn't gotten to it yet. He wrote back, I think some things wait for the right time. Maybe the car needed to be found when it could do the most good. He didn't know if that was true, but it felt like the right thing to say. The snow came in the middle of the morning. Wren was still at breakfast when the first flakes appeared against the window. Small ones, tentative, the kind that weren't fully committed yet. She saw them and pressed her face to the glass in the way she had, the way she'd done since the first week after activation, whenever something required more careful listening. What does it sound like? He asked. She was very still for a moment. It's quiet, she said, but not silent. There's a difference. She turned and looked at him. It lands on the roof, and it makes a sound like someone very carefully putting something down. Very carefully. He stood beside her and looked out at the white beginning of it, the flakes finding the branches and the street and the sill of the window, each one too small to see individually, but collectively making a change in everything. Daddy, she said. Yeah, when the car was in the garage for all those years, did it know it was worth a lot? He thought about this. Cars don't know things. But it was worth it anyway. Even when nobody knew. Yeah, he said. That's right. She was quiet for a moment, watching the snow. I think that's important, she said. What? That things can be worth something even when no one knows it yet. She turned from the window and picked up Chester and looked at him with the gravity she reserved for conclusions she'd arrived at herself. Because then when someone finds out, it's real. It was always real. He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, standing in their kitchen in the snowlight with a stuffed dog and cereal going cold on the counter and both ears working, and thought about a car under a tarp and an inventory sticker and a number written in error on a form that was worth $9,200,000 in wrong. That's exactly right, he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her cereal. He stood at the window a while longer, watching the snow commit, the tentative flakes becoming a real snowfall, the kind that was going to stick. Outside the neighborhood was going quiet in the particular way that snow made neighborhoods quiet, not absent of sound, but full of a different kind of it. The muffled hush of a world adjusting. He thought about the car, wherever it was now, a collector's garage somewhere, probably, already being assessed for restoration. The decades of rust and bad paint and abandonment being carefully undone so the truth of it could be visible again. The shape that had always been there, under the surface. The numbers that had always matched. He thought about Ren calling her name across the room 4 times to make sure it was real. He thought about the way she'd said, "It was always real." He put the kettle on for a second cup of coffee. The snow kept falling. The kitchen was warm. He thought about Paul's advice from those weeks of waiting. Take it one piece at a time. That was what you did with any large thing. The surgery, the legal fight, the years of saving, the particular love of raising a child alone. You did the next right thing in front of you and then the thing after that. You didn't try to hold the whole weight of it at once. The snow was building in earnest now, an inch on the sill already, more coming. Ren finished her cereal and brought the bowl to the sink and stood on her tiptoes to reach the faucet, the way she'd done since she was 4, and rinsed it the way she'd been taught. Chester sat on the counter and supervised. "What are we doing today?" she asked. "Whatever you want." She thought about this with appropriate seriousness. "Can we go to the park after the snow stops? Build something?" "Absolutely, a whale," she said. "We should build a snow whale. That's ambitious." "I know." She was already pleased with the ambition of it. "We'll need lots of snow." He looked out the window. More snow than they could use coming down at a steady rate. More than enough. "I think we'll have plenty," he said. Outside, the snow kept coming down, steady and quiet and unhurried. He stood at the window with his coffee and listened to his daughter talking to a stuffed dog about the structural engineering requirements of a snow whale, and the morning light came in flat and white and clear. And the world outside was making something new out of everything it covered.